Downsview panel. We look forward to an interesting afternoon. Waiting for a sense of how many of my colleagues are here. Leanne, do we have quorum?
I think we're tight, but yes, I believe so.
Good. Well, then let's begin this afternoon's session with a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Michael. Just bear with me. We acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty.
Thank you. Just a second here. So, welcome everyone to this afternoon's session. Just a moment here. Need to organize.
I believe Christina had an announcement, Michael.
Oh, thank you, Christina.
I'll start, Michael. I just wanted to take a minute to share with you that George Dark has retired from the design review panel. George joined the design review panel in 2017, offering his professional advice from the perspective of a landscape architect and urban designer. During George's tenure, we held 72 meetings. For the past 6 years, George has been an active member of the panel, contributing countless hours to review applications, studies, and design initiatives. His thoughtful and well-considered comments have consistently advocated for creative design solutions that combat climate change and improve the quality of life in the city. Through this advocacy on the panel, George has highlighted the critical role of landscape architects in city building. On behalf of the city, I would like to thank George for his time and dedication and to wish him well in his next adventures.
Thank you, Christina. And we'll miss you, George. So welcome and thank you for participating this afternoon. This is the project this afternoon for agenda item number 1 is the Jane Finch Initiative. This is a city study and the second review of the Jane Finch Initiative. For it, we have 1 hour and 10 minutes scheduled for the review. It's a formal review session, but there will be no vote taken at the end. Staff have been given 10 minutes for their presentation. This will be followed by a 15-minute presentation from the consultant. Discussion will follow these presentations. Session's being live streamed to YouTube. It's also being recorded. Recording will be available on City Planning YouTube channel following the meeting. So with that, we'll have a roll call just to make sure that that we have a quorum and that the technology is working. So if you could please confirm that you have that you are technically connected and that you have no conflict of interest. I'll start with you, Dima.
Here, no conflict.
Jessica.
Here, no conflict.
Jim Goff.
Here, no conflict.
Jim Melvin.
Here, no conflict.
Joe.
Here, no conflict.
Meg.
Here, no conflict.
Paul.
Here, but presenting, so not as a panel member.
Conflict. And Ralph.
I like that, Paul. No conflict.
Thank you. Did I miss anyone? Doesn't seem as I did. For panel members, Don't forget the staff questions. Please provide commentary on issues of concern and of appreciation. For speakers, I'll verbally introduce a 1-minute signal to indicate that you need to wrap up the presentation. And finally, we can begin with the staff presentation.
Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hoping you're seeing my first slide. Someone will let me know if that's not the case. I'm Leah Birnbaum. I'm a senior planner working on the Jane Finch initiative. On the top of this slide, you can see the list of the 3 divisions that are working on this project. So it is not just a planning study, it's a collaboration with social development and economic development as well. There we go. This is our second visit to the panel. So we were here in January with some high-level plans, and we're back here now with some more detailed built form options for some of the demonstration sites within the study area. And here is our study area outlined in black. So the secondary plan area is smaller in red. And we go from Highway 400 along the western edge to Black Creek in the east, and from Steeles in the north to Shepherd and a portion of the Black Creek in the south. And this slide illustrates the interdivisional nature of the project with shared community engagement. That's the overlap in the Venn diagram, led by our engagement partner, the Jane Finch Center. So they lead community engagement, which informs both the community development plan body of work, that's in the orange circle, and the land use plan body of work, that's in blue. And you also see a list of aligned initiatives on your screen. So I put in this slide because last time we were here, we discussed some of the really wonderful community assets that are already active and running in the community. And we want to keep those top of mind as we discuss future change. So I'm just pointing out a few of them, and this is not at all an exhaustive list, but at the north end of the study area is, of course, the Black Creek Community Farm. And that's the focus of some very vibrant energy toward food sovereignty. We're aiming to build on that through the Parks and Public Realms strategy and the Community Development Plan, and to enhance and encourage food-related initiatives in the area. I pointed out the Finch West LRT because that's being built. We'll have 4 stops running through the study area. The Jane Finch Community Hub and Center for the Arts is a community-led initiative to bring a hub to lands that were owned by Metrolinx adjacent to their maintenance and storage facility. Those lands have now been transferred to the city for the purpose of a future Jane Finch hub. So that's a big opportunity for some community-led social and economic activity right near the core of the study area. I mentioned Corner Commons. That's a pop-up community space that takes place in the parking lot of the Jane Finch Mall. That community space really demonstrates that there's a need for public space at that intersection. In fact, people are simply building it themselves in the meantime. The Community Music School of Toronto, this is formerly known as the Regent Park School of Music. They're already active in the area, but they're aiming to open a permanent location adjacent to the York Woods Library at Finch and Tobermory. Also, I haven't put this on the screen, but since we were here in January, there have been 2 new bike share stations installed in the area. So they're near the Finch Hydrolands, and more to come in bike share's future plans. And we also heard last time about things like connecting to the Northwest Cultural Trail and the Loop Trail, and we definitely have some opportunities to fill some gaps through this planning process for those connections. So we have a very active community advisory committee. They meet monthly. They have reviewed the materials that you're about to see. We went to them earlier this week. They had lots of input for us. It was a great discussion. And we have a parallel Indigenous engagement strategy that is underway. So that's connecting with the traditional rights holders, as well as Indigenous serving agencies in the area. And we've had some specific engagement reaching out to youth, especially high school students, that has informed some of the work that you're about to see. And I have on the screen just some of the key messages that we're hearing through community consultation that's been happening over the last couple of years. So there are some very strong concerns about affordability, particularly housing affordability, about gentrification, about displacement, particularly for Black Torontonians and for members of other equity deserving groups. There's a strong desire that change will benefit local communities, and a strong desire to lead with existing and future community-led initiatives around things like public space, growing food, social enterprises, local business development, public art, and so on. So we're really striving to keep all that in mind as we move through this project. As I mentioned, it's much more than just a planning study. It's more comprehensive with a community development plan as well. So these are just very quick refreshers. This is our urban structure, existing urban structure for the area. Both Jane and Finch have the avenues overlay at the intersection. They're not currently avenues for their full length within the study area. Here's our current land use map, very generally mixed use near the intersection and near the highway, apartment neighborhoods along Jane Street and neighborhoods generally behind. So this is our timeline. We're near the end now of phase 2. We're developing a draft secondary plan that we'll release later this summer. The community development plan is also being drafted in consultation with community. That's got some events coming up later this week. And we're bringing both of those plans to council in early 2024. So this is premature, but these are the issues to discuss with you today. I'll hand it over to Perkins and Will, who will take us through the built form options, but these are the questions that we'll be returning to at the end of their presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Paul, are you ready to start your presentation?
It'll actually be Eunice Wong from Senior Urban Designer and Associate from our office that'll be starting.
So you have 15 minutes, and at the 14-minute mark, I'll give you a verbal signal.
Hi all, we're happy to be back for our second visit on the Jane Finch Initiative, and we're excited to show you all of our progress since we were here last in January. So this is a bit of a agenda, a roadmap forward. We're going to start with a bit of a recap just as a refresher, share what we've been doing in the last few months. And this work is very much a work in progress, kind of a pause and moment in time in our design process. But there are a handful of key design issues that we hope to get the panel's input on. Next slide, please. As always, we want to start with our guiding principles and districts, which are not created from scratch. So R, as in our consultant work on the Jane Finch Initiative, builds on existing work from the ideas report and years of consultation, specifically drawing on the policy directions that came out of that process. So this is, again, just a quick snapshot of that report. Next slide. We also want to lead the study with equity and resilience. And to start that, we have to start with our vulnerable groups. So understanding that compared to the rest of the city, we have higher proportions of children and families, of older adults, intergenerational families, visible minorities, immigrants, and low income or unemployed folks. So for our policies, our design guidelines have to work for everyone, but especially these historically underserved groups. I know there's a lot of text here. This is just kind of a snapshot or excerpt from our working draft of our report. To pair that more quantitative analysis and socioeconomic approach to equity and resilience, we've also been busy with the qualitative work, like Leah mentioned, through a series of consultations, such as an open house in person, as well as virtually, and online public social pinpoint exercises. One thing to note in particular is that we worked with the organization Urban Minds, who, along with youth ambassadors in the neighborhood, facilitated a series of youth engagements. So we were able to consult the youth in the area, who are often a left out group of in these processes, and it was really insightful. So we did different mapping and collaging exercises and playing with pipe cleaners to map their journeys from home to school to really try to understand how they experience and perceive Jane Finch today, as well as their vision into the future. Currently, we're working on developing a final report, which is really, we've been calling it a bit of an umbrella or a folder for both setting the stage of what's there today, but also provides a roadmap of design and policy recommendations. And you'll see on the right, that annotated diagram. We're really making sure that in our recommendations, we're addressing the who, what, when, where, and why. When we were here last time, we outlined our 3 themes, which are greening, moving, and building, which are essentially the guiding buckets for our parks and public realm strategy, our mobility and transit integration strategy, and a land use plan and urban design approach and urban design guidelines. And I'll go through each one of these a little quickly because some of this will be a recap from January. So first, greening is about acknowledging and enhancing the green assets we have in the neighborhood today, from the ravine to the sports fields and hydro corridor in the neighborhood. And on the next slide, here's just a bullet list of some of our big moves under this greening bucket. It includes new parks and squares, green spines, which again are the landscape setbacks along Jane and Finch that we want to protect, embodying both Indigenous heritage, but also the cultural identity of the area today, as well as improving the park assets we have today in the neighborhood. So as an example, you can see kind of a snapshot of our work in progress report. Some of our strategies include on the bottom left there, some NDVI analysis and how we kind of infuse more greenness in that core intersection of Jane and Finch to combat issues like heat vulnerability. So proposing new parkland where they are, much needed resources or where there are parkland deficiencies. But resources not just as social or civic spaces, but also refuge from heat. On the right there, we are also acknowledging that open spaces and the public realm is more than just our capital P parks, but there are other typologies like courtyards or porches, transit plazas and mid-block connections, and much of these non-park typologies exist today in between townhouses, in front of tower apartments. So we wanted to make sure that we keep this diversity of open spaces into the future as well. Next, moving quickly is just about how we move from away from the car-dominated past of Jane Finch into something that's much more walkable, bikeable, and transit accessible, especially with the Finch West LRT running through this neighborhood. And just in the next slide, some big moves include enhancing safety, comfort, connectivity, and just making it a much more pleasant experience getting around the neighborhood, getting where you need to go, and filling in some of those gaps in that network like Leah had spoken about. As an example, again, another excerpt from our work in progress, a big focus on safety is demonstrated here, responding to where conflicts have occurred between vehicles and pedestrians in the area in the past, and then providing strategies that enhance safety. For example, on the right, we have specific strategies on improving safety around school sites, including raised crossings, better signage, painting of crosswalks, and integrating in cycling in proximity to these school destinations as well. Lastly, building as a recap is also about how we acknowledge that Jane Finch is a growing neighborhood and that we want it to grow into a complete community without losing the neighborhood's unique cultural identity. So next slide, some of the big moves here include creating those complete mixed-use communities, maintaining the retail heart of Jane and Finch with the mall sites there today, which Paul will be getting into a bit more detail on, and then supporting incremental growth with how we do phasing strategy, especially for these larger sites. In the back of this slide in the graphic is a quick snapshot of some of the development activity. We're looking north towards the intersection of Jane and Finch. Some of the development activity in this area today. So we want to be responsive to both, the existing context, but also the planned or the emerging context we see here. Last time we showed you this map on the right, where the two shades of pink, we were identifying smaller and larger scales of change. We wanted to further break this down and take a closer look at factors like physical context, lot sizes, proximity to transit, the existing diverse set of building types and heights and scales, and areas where we're already seeing growth happen or where they will be anticipated. So with these factors, we've kind of broken down these scales of change into a series of districts for the secondary plan area of Jane and Finch. You can see the list of them on the left, and in hopes that these districts add more granularity to the scales of change that you saw in the last slide. So next slide, within those districts, which you see again ghosted in the background on the right, we dove a little deeper and created focus areas or demonstration sites. So these are areas where we've tested and we've created conceptual draft plans and massings to really test for contextual fit and scale. And These have then helped us to develop some draft policy and design guideline language to ensure that we can guide and shape that growth in a way that's responsive to each of the district's unique contexts. So I guess in other words, we're looking specifically on creating recommendations that deviate from typical city design guidelines to really respond to the unique context of the neighborhood. So the 4 focus areas we've tested include one along Jane Street, one along Finch, one in the North Finch area, that's the number 3, kind of the western bookend of the study area, and then the main intersection, number 4 there, the largest and the most central sites of the neighborhood. You can see some of our guiding questions there on the left, which really help capture why we chose these as our testing sites. For example, along the arterial streets of Jane and Finch, how can we support infill or new development, urbanization of these streets? For North Finch, we're focused on how can we support and encourage job growth and keep those community serving uses that are there today. And then the main intersection, we're really trying to figure out how can we create a really vibrant, walkable, inclusive, and transit supportive community there with keeping some of those local serving uses. So we'll be going through each of our focus areas that we've tested so far. And yeah, Paul will walk through some of our thinking and questions around each one that we hope we get your help on.
Thank you, Eunice. I think it's maybe worth sort of rewinding a bit and just understanding that this entire area was master planned, and there were very clear sort of disposition of parks, schools, and other amenities throughout the neighborhood, clear hierarchies of where density went, and sort of ideas about how those maybe worked and stitched themselves together that maybe don't deliver on that promise today, 50, 60 years later. At the same time, there's some of the demographic changes that Eunice described. And so that paired with the sort of development pressure, I think, really is the focus of what we're trying to use to identify the path forward that is really discrete and unique to the context and the area, and maybe builds upon typical mid-rise, but typical tall building guidelines to respond to that context. So just very briefly to highlight, the Jane Street and Finch corridors really characterized by the green character. I'm going to do these out of sequence. Deep setbacks, oftentimes in monocultures, so really broad lawns. You can see the bottom right image, narrow sidewalks, very little street amenity, furniture, lighting, or anything of that nature, but also a mix of building types. While we do have a predominance of these tower in the park, the bottom left suggests the master plan for the Grassways project at the TCH site that is looking at a much more podium and tower configuration. And then we also have the large townhouse sites in between. Next. So moving forward, we're really looking at a kind of infill design approach that may be a mix of mid or tall buildings that really looks to protect or build and evolve that green spine into something more, but also connects these neighborhoods, or sorry, the street, deeper into the neighborhoods and the amenities beyond, and then being sort of methodical about maybe where retail could exist, understanding it can't be everywhere. Next slide sort of highlights a particular area, and you can really quickly see that sort of diversity of building types. The grays, the existing buildings, the purple are approved and in some cases under construction mid-rise buildings that follow very strictly the avenues guidelines, and then some of the other building types. So a few of the key questions we're looking at here are the correct built form response given a kind of diversity of podium conditions and heights, and then where an appropriate tower placement could be. We do believe that some of these sites could accommodate more than mid-rise, but we want to be respectful of how much we maybe push those towards the street or towards the parks and the neighborhoods beyond understanding the impacts on one versus the other. Another key question is these mid-block connections that dive deep into the neighborhoods. They're nice on paper, but we also have to understand that these will often be the sole servicing access and driveway for some of these buildings, especially on the infill sites, and how we pair that pedestrian function and that kind of connectivity, Green Street's ideas, low impact development, with the sort of necessary function. And then another issue is the setback. We're really looking to establish, we've put forward a 5-meter deep setback, but looking to also come up with landscape strategies and streetscape strategies that look to increase the biodiversity within those areas while maintaining that sort of amenity of the green spine. Next slide. Moving to Finch, this is a slightly different character. And what we do have here is a larger preponderance of these large townhouse complexes where it's a single owner. And so we do see these potentially in the near term as being quite attractive soft sites for landowners. And kind of the key question we're grappling with here is sort of, do we take a traditional approach that privileges the sort of continuous street wall along the main street? So that's the approach on the left. With smaller breaks in between? Or instead, do we look to align our public spaces, mid-block connections, parks with the grid of the street network behind? And so instead privileging the kind of permeability, connectivity into those neighborhoods back and forth to the transit amenity, and then orienting buildings in a way that maybe breaks down that street frontage. It's a little bit less important, a little bit more in keeping with the landscape character. And so two discrete approaches. I'm going to do this quickly, so we'll just skip to North Finch, please. Anyone that's done work recently along 427 East Mall, West Mall is probably familiar with this condition. The big difference here is it's not residential. What we've got here is a mix of hotel, police station, long-term care facility uses, all in these kind of pizza sliced long, deep lots. Very much characterized by a auto-dominated parking arrangement, and then that kind of adjacency condition to the highway. Next slide, please. So from a vision perspective, we do see this as an area that's actually going to be completely transformed and redeveloped in the long term. Phasing is a kind of question, but also the opportunity to leverage some of the city-owned sites within that area to maybe bridge multiple landowners into a cohesive vision is something that we believe could happen to start to introduce some residential uses together with the existing mixed-use character. Next slide just sort of starts to highlight some of these issues. And the key questions we're looking at, I think, is maybe a unique opportunity to adjust the build form in a way that starts to perhaps mitigate some of the negative impacts of the highway, whether it's noise, particulate matter, pollution, and other things, in a way that then protects a kind of inner sanctum of open spaces, public streets, and residential uses. We've got a bit of an opportunity here in that the immediate adjacent stuff across the street is the MSF, the maintenance facility, hydro corridor, and other sort of non-residential uses. So shadow impacts may not be the driving force here, and we can be a little bit more creative in the disposition of towers. I'm just going to ask if we have one more minute, and we'll kind of 2 more minutes, and we can get through this quickly. The intersection.
You do have a couple more minutes, yes.
Thank you. The intersection is really characterized by the 3 large malls on either site. 2 of them have active sort of planning processes or development applications, and another one is likely not far behind. It's important maybe to highlight that these aren't sort of, this isn't Sherway or Square One. These are sort of local malls and the predominance of independent retailers. And so beyond a kind of retail function, there is a kind of community use here. We see the Spot as a community hub. Seneca College has a use on the 2nd floor of Yorkgate Mall. And so there are other uses beyond retail that we feel are very critical that need to be replaced. And I think we've seen versions of this at the Golden Mile, perhaps a couple of weeks ago at the last panel session. Next step here, next slide, please. So we do see these as being completely transformative areas. Massive or redevelopment will create a walkable network of pedestrian streets. Mixed use density in both mid and tall buildings will add a significant amount of population. And we really want to find ways to develop retail main streets, so things that really start to recreate some of that, not only the form and the function, but some of the social uses that are in the malls today, in a kind of new model, understanding the challenges that come with that, but ultimately in a way that delivers sort of the social heart and uses of the community. So next slide just maps, this is Yorkgate Mall at the north west corner specifically. This is really an indicative plan and one that we've developed without consultation with the landowner, but starts to hit upon the key highlights of the grid of streets, breaking down the larger blocks, providing access in a way that also conforms to some idea of staging, new park within that area, to Eunice's earlier comments around the sort of equitable distribution of green space and the provision of areas where there are sort of issues with heat. But a key question here we're struggling with, or we'd like to sort of consider, or the panel to consider, is the retail uses. We're showing a north-south sort of parallel retail street, really trying to recreate a kind of two-sided retail street. And then we've rendered in a couple diverse ways. So the southern leg is a public right-of-way. The north is maybe a pedestrian, maybe private driveway. There's the smaller plaza in orange at the intersection, sort of privileging the solar access in those areas. And then kind of a parallel question is if these are the smaller scale, independent, perhaps spaces, what is the appropriate retail on Jane and Finch proper? Understanding these buildings will have multiple fronts, and we do want to kind of have an active front at the sort of transit stations themselves. So a couple key questions there. Next slide just sort of highlights our attempt at using the sort of public right-of-way, so an 18.5 meter right-of-way to deliver on some of these functions, and looking for maybe some of the panel's advice on the sort of disposition of car lanes, parking, bike infrastructure, but also being very conscious about how you deliver a successful retail environment within that context. Next slide.
1 minute left.
All right, thank you. And then the last bit here is really around the connection of community uses and their relationship to amenities within there. And so we do believe that there is going to be a provision of maybe daycares or other community hubs could be located in the podiums of these buildings and then directly adjacent to the park without having to cross vehicular traffic. Apologize, one more slide just to talk a bit about implementation. We're also very conscious that this isn't, the Galleria Mall, for example, where staging is really just a question of how quickly you can build it. The reality is some of the staging and phasing here may take a decade or two, and there may be fits and starts depending on the markets. And so there's a idea here that maps out a potential staging. So the first on the left is the current proposal. This is a live application for a tall building in front of the city planning currently. And you can see it's really the main drivers here about the provision of parking, existing lease agreements that guarantee visibility to signage. And so you've ended up with a building kind of in the back corner. Next, we're sort of looking at how do you start to introduce streets, and is there ways for the multiple landowners to potentially redevelop independent of each other, and are there policies that can facilitate that? And then the last slide sort of assumes a kind of breakdown of the site. And so are there maybe policies around the recreation of entrances, streetscapes, and other amenities, if you imagine the condition on the right existing for 5 to 10 years, that we could include in this work to support a kind of high quality public realm should a interim condition like this exist longer than a short period of time. And with that, I'll just wrap with the final questions and hand things back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So panel, it's an opportunity for questions of clarification. We've got about 5 minutes. So I'll ask you to either put up your virtual or actual hand. And I saw Ralph put his hand up, his actual hand, and I'm going to get the list of participants here. Just a second to see if I see any additional hands go up. So I see Ralph, Dima, and Jim. Ralph, do you want to go first?
Just about existing development approvals and plans. You mentioned at the northwest corner, there's that one tower up in the triangle there that is in front of city staff. Are there any other specifically around the intersection? Because I just vaguely remember seeing some at another panel session, specifically the southeast quadrant.
Yeah, so the southeast, and sorry, through the chair, the southeast quadrant has a planning study that's underway. I don't believe they've made a formal application, but there is a lot of material available in the public realm, and we have spoken and coordinated with them. that's one reason we're not showing them specifically, just because it's an ongoing piece, but not formal at the moment.
Okay. Is that
Okay.
okay, Ralph? Let's move
Okay.
on to,
Yeah.
oh,
No, that's it.
Dima, Jim, Goff, and Joe. So, Dima?
A couple of questions. One, in the study that was done, is there sort of a heart to the community or several hearts to the community? Because there's all these plans to increase pedestrian, but is it the malls that where people gather? Where is there a pedestrian heart to a community now? Or is the part of this project to kind of create like a pedestrian street that people naturally will gravitate to?
I can attempt to answer that. I don't believe there's a kind of traditional pedestrian heart. People do very much gravitate to the malls. They are very much they're more the town square than a kind of retail mall, given the kind of social functions and well, community services, but also social activities and seniors walks and that sort of thing that happen there, and art shows and that nature. There is maybe a different form of inhabiting the public realm than you may imagine downtown. And so there are a lot of the squares and the courtyards between townhouses have a kind of very unique to Jane Finch way of inhabiting them that responds to kind of larger social or familial or kinship patterns. And then there's very much the kind of usage of the schoolyards and the ravine system and other park networks for that, but it's not in a kind of walking down Queen Street kind of way.
Okay. I'll ask a question about that again later, but and the other question I have in terms of the study, typologically, this neighborhood and beyond the single family residence is really defined certainly along its main streets by this kind of tower and the park approach. And I'm just wondering if part of the review that you guys considered was actually how to address those buildings that are kind of isolated and surrounded by parking, to see whether there were opportunities in creating new built form or actually redefining the public realm to tie those buildings together more coherently so they're less islands on their own.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I'll say maybe it's something where we're a little bit deficient on. We've been looking at some of the RAC zoning work around kind of introduction of commercial uses into those buildings. That's currently underway, but a detailed public realm kind of reconfiguration is not something we've looked at, but I think it's a point well taken.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dima. Joe and Jim, we have just a time for a couple of brief questions from each of you, starting with you, Jim.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Paul or Eunice, I guess I'm curious about the idea of this green spine on Jane Street. Is that really in a recognition that you do have all these buildings that are just tower in the park there, and you're trying to deal with that reality and kind of turn it into a positive? It sort of relates to Dima's question too about, being able to bring development closer to the street and make it more pedestrian oriented. Is that what was the driving force there is the question, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think the missing piece here is we didn't present our detailed mobility strategy, and so we heard loud and clear that both Jane and Finch are very popular areas of pedestrian movement and passing through, and you can just spend any time there. You'll see groups of 2, 3, 4 people walking with assisted mobility devices and all of those things, people waiting for the bus, and so there was very clear request for a wider, just basic fundamental sidewalk widths. So our 2.1 meter sidewalks are not sufficient. We're proposing 3.75, I think, throughout. And then the green spine is more of a landscape strategy that sort of acknowledges that heritage, that history, looks to it as a positive, as an amenity, that supports the area and then looks to grow. So we are looking to grow beyond the monoculture of lawns and then elaborate upon the kind of tree canopy ultimately, because there are sort of benefits of sort of shade and stormwater management that we think kind of work in a virtuous cycle throughout there. And then also protecting for future LRT and BRT along Jane is another reason for 5-meter setbacks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Briefly, Joe.
To the team, I didn't see an ownership map, a property map, that in my experience typically really informs a revitalization plan such as this, especially at the 4 corners of the main intersection at Jane and Finch. Can I ask the design team, did you seriously look at the ownership and property map, and how did that influence some of the work we're seeing, or did it?
Yeah, if we could just flip back to one of the ones of York Gate. Joe, it's actually, we're quite blessed in that the entire southeast corner is one ownership. The southwest corner is one ownership, and then the northwest is ultimately it's 2 owners. So there's the mall, which is the entire kind of, if you look at the grid here, it's the 3 on the outside, and then the corner at the intersection itself is the gas station is a separate ownership. So that street grid roughly follows the property divisions.
Good. Thank you. Panel members, we're going to proceed into the panel discussion. We've got about 28 minutes, and there's 7 of us, so that's a self-managed 4 minutes per person, a generous amount compared to other meetings. You are no doubt familiar with these questions about built form scenarios, and do they respond to the unique character? The mall sites, do they have the ingredients for success? And does the built form strategy respond to the unique context of the edges, the highway, the hydro corridor, and the management facility or maintenance facility? So with that, I'm going to use the same list that we did at the beginning for the roll call. So it'll be Dima, Jessica, Jim, Goff, Jim, Melvin, Joe, Meg, and then Ralph. So beginning with you, Dima.
Thank you for the presentation. I'll try to answer, maybe I'll tackle the questions, because I think that's where I was thinking. One of the things that sort of struck me with the introduction of the priorities of like greening, built form, and connections was maybe, I think there was a community layering, like strengthening community ties. Maybe that's built into the connections, but I think it needs to be made more explicit in the design, and in how certain things are approached. I think one thing that is incredible with the Jane Finch area is the very high level of immigrant communities and you know, minorities, and there seems to be like a, I'm looking through, like, you know, having driven through the area and just going through it now in Google Maps, there is a lack of cultural identity in the area. And I feel with a project of this scale, there's a real opportunity for finding ways of communities being able to appropriate their streets, appropriate their parks, redefine it in their image, opportunities for community gathering. So the lack of me, like, there's a lack of like a, or like a equivalent of Queen Street, and that's, you know, okay, but I think there is a sense of where do the public gathering and the public community and that town square that I think in the mall redevelopment can be really emphasized and fully supported. And then just to go back to the built form, if the approach is to sort of fully embrace the tower and the park and take advantage of the fact that these buildings have a lot of, well, not green space, a lot of it is parking, but have a lot of space around them, then see how to maybe this for the city, incentivize greening those parking spaces to give owners incentive to do that, but also then to really create a promenade that becomes more pleasurable to walk on, because there's a lot of lanes of traffic. It's hugely busy. It's hugely uh, uh, from walking around right near heavy traffic is not always a very pleasant experience. So finding ways to mitigate that and certainly making the sidewalks wider, adding a lot more. There's a real lack of trees in the neighborhoods, so increasing treescapes and variety in the sidewalk. So it's not just these flat, endless plains of lawn, as you were mentioning. The other thing I was trying to understand in your in the sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the area. The one that curves up is whether there has been shadow studies to study the options between having the buildings perpendicular to Finch or parallel to Finch, in terms of impact on shadow on Finch Street, to try to keep that as lit as possible. I realize the building's on the north side of the street, but to consider shadow impacts on our pedestrians when looking at built form, and developing sort of this variety of, I guess, a variety of form, whether it's, I'm just going to go back, sorry, to the 3D view. There, maybe not all towers in the park stay towers in the park. There's a sense of opportunity of adding density in a way that would actually help support pedestrian realm, help support retail, help support like providing amenities for the community, that I think would be very beneficial to the area and their development. And I think those are some of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dima. Next, Jessica.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your presentation today. It's great to see how this has advanced since we saw it last. And I think, it's a really exciting initiative with great potential to influence how unique communities can grow, with significant consideration for those existing populations and histories and cultures. So thanks for bringing it to us today. For the Jane Street South and the Finch districts, I think maintaining these large setbacks to create this sort of green spine for the sort of nature-based benefits, I think is wonderful. Sort of growing up in an area that had very similar conditions, it was all, something that people did enjoy. We did enjoy walking in those spaces. It was sort of a unique condition to sort of what I experience now where I live. So, just looking at those lawns, I'm a landscape architect, they would make wonderful pollinator gardens. So I think there's tons of, potential there for community involvement as well. Regarding the question of sort of retail in the ground floor of some of those buildings or some of the new buildings that come in, I do question it. And you sort of answered a question I had. One of the diagrams, I think it was on page 22, showed sort of these purple buildings. And so, if those are already approved and they sort of jut out, maybe that's where potentially there could be sort of a hybrid solution to allow for some retail to occupy some space within that spine, to encourage some other street level activity. But I encourage maintaining that sort of green space for the good of the world. With regards to Finch and the setbacks along that street, the street wall option to me seemed maybe, and it wasn't, I mean, it was fairly, diagram, wasn't terribly detailed, but it seemed almost like it could create sort of a bit of a sterile condition along that stretch, and maybe those direct connection options could provide sort of more opportunity to spill into the community and back out from the residences further north. And then that could also start to provide some gathering space for sort of maybe even some small scale local serving retail shops. And then just on the Norfolk Finch district, I think there might be a potential there to leverage a buffer zone adjacent to the highway, potential to maybe connect that up into the hydro corridor. I think it was perhaps on some more sort of earlier diagrams. some of the more artistic ones. But I think, that could be a great way to sort of infuse this small pocket that's kind of trapped between the highway and the community hub / metro yard with sort of a really green character. And then regarding the intersection district, obviously the largest scale of change happening in that area, potentially the biggest impact on the community. So I think, successful retail spaces, providing the community with similar retail offerings as found in the mall is going to be really critical. But I think it's tough. You have to balance it with accessibility, equity, and public gathering spaces that can be used throughout the seasons, which is always the challenge with malls and what they provide to communities in terms of respite from the weather. So I just one question I had was, is the idea of a retail main street the answer, or should we be looking at some other configuration? I'm not saying an inward focused mall at the base of the podium is the answer, but perhaps some hybrid that uses publicly accessible space to tie the various retail and community uses together. Again, potentially giving back that town hall feeling. And then final comment here was just it's not related to built form, but the traffic calming opportunities in the mobility section. They're really exciting from an immediate short-term perspective. These moves can happen quickly and they can make a big improvement to safety and start to encourage and get the conversation about walkability in the community going. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. Next, Jim Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think Jessica said a lot of what I was planning to say very eloquently, so I'm not going to bore you with repeating it all. I do think it's very important to build on the avenues designation on both Jane and Finch, and to really focus on that intersection as kind of ground zero for change, which I think Leah already mentioned, where, informal retail is already happening. And so I think there needs to be a way to really kind of build on that to create more of a pedestrian oriented juggernaut of activity going there that will then be supported by greater city interventions and getting the developers on side, because right now the intersection does feel like one vast parking lot with some small retail buildings way off in the distance. And I think getting things right up against the intersection would make a huge change. The North Finch strategy, I think, makes a lot of sense in terms of buffering against the highway and trying to, again, create something that is really street fronted as well. And I would look forward to future discussions that do bring the mobility strategy more into the overall discussion as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Jim Melvin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Eunice and Paul, for your presentation. I think some of the improvements over the last presentation is the finer grain of pedestrian movements that we're seeing, such as the loop trail and those kind of things being introduced. But I think Jessica hit it right on the head in that I believe the nature of Jane and Finch, Jane Street and Finch Avenue West, are not going to be a viable commercial retail experience unless you do something to the streets themselves. And I think that would include considering, and transportation might not like this, but considering bike lanes and parking on the streets on Jane and Finch itself, slowing everything down and making the identity of Finch and Jane as you near the intersection, the core, something really unique. I'd even think of changing texture of the pavements, or really a lot of trees, or something that introduces a sense of what this community is, a feel to this community. I don't see it happening with the study now, in that other than the LRT going through and saying we'll introduce more building frontages on Jane, I don't see that accomplishing anything that would be close to a BIA kind of feel. I'm in this community business improvement area, but I think as Jim just said, the goal is to make the BIA a quad of the intersection of Jane and Finch, which is probably good. And then my question is, how do you treat Jane and Finch in that quad to permit more casual movement of pedestrians north and south, east and west? And is that connecting the finer grain streets that you're introducing, or something else that makes that kind of a cozy community feel? I think some of the space that Paul talked about on between York Gate Boulevard and Jane starts to address that with the kind of the imaginary infill that they're looking at there. However, the next block right on Jane is a gas station, and how do you convert those kind of spaces into something that isn't a blank on the map? And it's one of the harder side of the intersections to deal with. I do like the idea of not a continuous built wall along the street, but a sidewall conditions with a more safer, I'll call it courtyard space or something between the buildings, rather than just a massive building set back from the street. I think that would provide a little more community. So I think if the study can address a little more transportation issues, and that may not even be its mandate, but I think part of the solution to giving this a identity lies in doing something with the streets. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Joe, then Meg, then Ralph. Joe?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the team for bringing the work forward. I honestly see a bit of a gap between the aspirations described, the analysis of the place, and what I imagine and believe is necessary for a secondary plan, which is to provide a very clear roadmap for how to take a place from where it is to where it ought to be. My sense is the work is highly conceptual, kind of 10,000-foot level. But that, that kind of clarity and vision about and inspiration, candidly, about the transformation in the community, I find missing in the work thus far. The built form analysis seems highly diagrammatic, and in some cases, candidly not believable. The northwest quadrant, to me, is not convincing. Major buildings, like a single building with 3 towers and a massive podium with potentially 800 units in it, or, to me, is not an appropriate way to imagine improving on this community. And that's kind of what it seems, except it's not explored enough that we can really tell 3-dimensionally what this feels like. I understand there's some purpose in this sort of folksy graphics and kind of accessible, quote unquote, graphics, and keeping it simple. And I'm not suggesting some kind of photorealistic image of the future, but the lack of evidence of built form exploration in a 3-dimensional lake accompanied with metrics, I find troublesome. I think as a city, when we're dealing with a secondary plan on an area as important as this and building on the incredible transit investment, we need to really up our game in terms of the ambition of an exercise like this to help imagine and visualize the future. The visualizations to me are really lacking in terms of what the place might be. You cannot cartoon your way to the future, with my deepest respect to city staff. We need to really pick up the game here. The topic of community capacity and the nature of the way in which this place will grow, how quickly it will grow, what those impacts will be, that needs to be really explored. We need metrics, and I didn't see any of those. I didn't see any three-dimensional depictions that help me understand the future. Yes, greening, moving, building, those are all wonderful aspirations, but we need a better roadmap. And the cartoons aren't doing it for me, candidly. I'm very nervous about concentrations of housing near highways and the assumption that by putting huge amounts of building walls near highways, we can protect the communities from their impacts. As we've learned previously, for example, down in Lee Side and the lower East Side, the major air quality impacts from things like the Gardiner Expressway are not immediately adjacent to the Gardiner Expressway, but some distant from it because of the way air quality impacts occur. So I would love to see more analysis, more thought about the highway adjacencies. I'm not convinced about those at all. When I look at the questions, does the built form strategy respond to the unique context? I don't see a built form strategy, candidly. I don't see it. So the final thing I would say, I think, is that that intersection, those 4 quadrants, not 3, the 4 quadrants, I would really like to see like 3 scenarios, built form scenarios for how they may evolve that accommodate phasing and evolution of development and the existing retail uses in a realistic fashion. And putting those out for discussion and explorations that really can inspire landowners, inspire community people to understand what the possibility of the place may be. I'm not feeling it, candidly, not yet. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Meg, and then Ralph.
Hi, thank you. Joe said it well, or I echo what Joe has said here. The approach seems generic and not necessarily and not contextual. There's key info missing, including details on some of the things that you spoke to, like the schools and the ravine and other elements that are critical to understanding the existing function and character of the neighborhood. It's not in the drawings. I mean, it feels very tentative. It lacks, like I said, information, but it also lacks definition and vision. It feels afraid. I would support Joe. I think it needs to get a lot more, like there's really nothing, it's very difficult to comment on anything because there doesn't feel like there's a lot to comment on at this point because of its generic nature and because it's lacking detail and information. I would say, so like Joe, I don't see a built form strategy here to comment on. I think it needs to get a lot deeper and a lot potentially messier. I had the same thought as Joe that there should be multiple, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3 scenarios done that then can be dug into by all the various stakeholder groups and commented on, so that it's only through presenting something like that I think you're going to get the most useful feedback and the most insight back. There's just the 10,000 foot level isn't going to provide the appropriate or the insightful feedback required to advance this. Having said all of that, the aspirations, like you folks said, the thesis here is to support incremental growth, create complete mixed-use communities, promote and create walkability and bikeability. Those exactly, like, amazing. I think the incremental growth piece is particularly important, and I think that this is this work could set a new precedent, really, for how we, as a city, attack that very complicated idea of incremental growth. And maybe the three scenarios do that to some extent, but you're going to have to allow for the fact that over the course of time, any number of things could happen, but we need a framework in which that can happen. You talked about at the Jane South and Finch piece, prioritizing neighborhood connectivity. I think that's that needs to be added to that list of three visions, or the vision statement around incremental growth, complete communities, and walkability and bikeability. And you're alluding to it in various ways. I think that that's a critical piece. I think you have to do it everywhere. I think that can be very much a guiding principle. Like Jim, Melvin, and others have commented, a lot needs to be done on the streets. And in order to be able to create that neighborhood connectivity that is so critical to the success of, I think, any neighborhood, and this one, may be different in its morphology, of course, but like that neighborhood connectivity is something we're needing all across the city. And so the streets here are wide, they're vast, they're long, they're inhospitable. So tackling what that means is for the city needs to be front and center of any strategy around which you're going to contemplate the various scenarios that are proposed here. So to my mind, one last point on which I think it can be specific. A lot of concern for me about replacing the social space of the mall, the retail and social space of the mall, underlining the social space at the moment, with retail main streets. They don't replace that. And so that's something to, I think, give deeper and renewed thought to. Creating that social space is one that is functional 365 days of the year and at many hours is a critical piece of any community, and this one is no exception. Thank you.
Thanks, Meg. And finally, Ralph.
Wow, playing cleanup. I don't feel like I got to be careful because I don't want to be seen as piling on, but I kind of feel I've been had a little bit, and I please apologize. I'm just using that word not because that's the case. It just seems that it's very superficial. That we're being shown certain things, but there's like I don't see the meat. I don't see the meat, and it's incredibly polite. It's incredibly politically correct, and maybe that's because it's a public process and it's a public study. We in our firm we're not inhibited by that. We get to show visions of what our clients are trying to deliver. And maybe we have an advantage there. But I do believe that there's a lack of vision here. And it's kind of odd at the beginning. There are two things that kind of drop my shoulders. One is that it's not just planning, right? It's economic development, social, community facilities, new enterprise. It's more than just one thing. It's a spirit of a place that you need to actually embrace and make it galvanic. And I just see these kind of little studies, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. I mean, it's missing the big ideas. And I was, at dinner with a couple of people last night. One is an author and urbanist, and another one is the publisher of Azure magazine. And they were so depressing because they said that there's no vision. Like, where is the vision for the city? And if there's any opportunity that we have to create a strong vision, it's here. And I pushed back saying, well, it's not any singular vision. It's a vision that is in constant evolution. If there's any neighborhood in the city that is experiencing this constant evolution, it's this neighborhood. It's incredibly important. Our firm was approached by the owners of the Northwest and the Southeast sites. And I guess they just didn't like what they were hearing from us. So we're not working on that, which also kind of gets me really nervous. Because really there's 4 owners that control the intersection of Jane and Finch, which in my opinion is the heart of the challenge here and the heart of the opportunity here. You cannot be timid. You have to unleash your hounds. You have to embrace the complex, wonderful diversity that exists in this neighborhood. But it's odd that I hear that, well, the one quadrant, which is quite large one, there's ongoing conversations. We're talking to them, but yet we don't really know what those discussions are. So we're just assuming it's the same approach as the Northwest study that we're being presented, which is incredibly timid. And in some ways, I think dangerously presented that it may never work. What is the vibrancy of those existing assets is the fact that they cannot attract the tenants that they would rather attract. And so we're battling now, these wonderful tenancies, this mix of interesting people and retail businesses that are there that may not get replaced because these asset managers are not interested in that. How do you convince or force a developer to embrace everything unless you get them really excited, start showing how much value there is in terms of what the city's vision is. And if the city's vision is only grassroots, I don't see it's going to possibly be executed. I see a square. Yes, it's a square. Is it a successful square? I don't know. But is it an idea about 4 quadrants and that each quadrant has maybe a square and each square should be different and each quadrant should have a park and each park can be different and can evolve and can be a tapestry. Connecting those across, I don't see any idea of connectivity whatsoever. And I think, at the beginning, all the members here were, I'm going to say, giving great advice. And it was just kind of like, yep, I could see all that nice CDs that we're talking about, but there's nothing big here, nothing big. And I implore you that if you don't get the actual asset managers, owners of those properties together and really understand what their retail ambitions are, because again, you can just say you're going to put retail, but somebody might just say, well, I don't want to put that much retail. And then you're saying, well, I want a little retail street with a start and a finish that goes nowhere. I just think that the vision is missing. The energy that I thought was going to be coming out, oozing out, or fireworks out of the pages about how exciting and how important this study is in this neighborhood. I mean, you have 4 corners. I mean, we do a mall and it's 1 corner. You've got 4 corners of an important intersection with transit coming and a neighborhood that is all dying, yearning for a sense of community. I mean, I don't even understand why the community music school, somebody should be saying, why do we have to put it way down the road? It should be right at the corner, right? We should let the library stay there. Oh, well, the library's nice. It's in a green space. But how does the new community hub connect to this 4 corners? I just think there's a lot that is there. It's just, I think you guys should just really go for it. Really go for it. And I'm telling you, it's also disheartening to hear that there's a little limited budget. So we have to keep it light. So if there is a limited budget, whatever you do better be impactful. And clearly the graphics are strong, and I completely agree with Joe. It's just not much there. And I think that you need to just understand what the personality of the neighborhood is, and how do you physically represent that personality. And whether it's towers, mid-rise, podiums, I think it's a bigger idea first. Big idea about what this neighborhood is and what it can be and how exciting it's going to be. You then need to bring on the real partners that are going to execute it, which are the private sector owners of the 4 quadrants. And one thing I was going to ask, and again, I'm just going to make a plea, is years ago, we were invited to a workshop charrette in Yorkville that Urban Design ran. And they brought, 4 or 5 of the largest landowners that controlled that quadrant of Yorkville that the study was about. and they stuck him in a room to try to come up with a plan. And what can you do? And then there were four teams, and they came back at the end, and you had the president of these major development corporations there experiencing it. I think that this is such an important neighborhood, such an important opportunity to represent a vision of Toronto for the future in this study. And I think that you got the right people, I believe, to do it. And I just think it needs a lot more vision.
Thank you, Ralph. We're gonna close the session. You know, there's no vote, but we're also trying to change a little bit the way in which the chair summary works. So the intent is to rely more on the notes taken by Leanne and the video, and less on specifically this summary right now. So everything you've just said, of course, recorded by video and Leanne, and then the role of Meg Gordon and I will be to find 5 key points to take away from this session from our perspective. So I'm going to suggest, first of all, that when we look at the preparatory work done to set the context for the built form study, it's admirable. But I think what we're hearing is that it needs to be looked at in a stronger way. As you said, Ralph, take the bull by the horns and bring on the private sector landowners. Very important. Number 2, connectivity, neighborhood and community is incredibly challenging in an environment with such wide rights of way that prevent community from connecting across those streets. So if we don't look at the transportation infrastructure seriously, then the likelihood is that a lot of the good work here may not succeed. Thirdly, the sense is that the built form scenarios proposed feel generic, and they need to more specifically reflect the great work done by at the outset to try to capture the character and energy of the community and have it reflected more specifically in the built forms. And then I would say that finally, that there's a lot of great work, preparatory work done, and I think panel is seeing that it just needs to be better reflected in the built form strategies put forward, with more analysis, more scenarios, more meat to discuss and see how the earlier evidence can be more clearly manifest in the built forms proposed. Thank you, panel. Interesting discussion. Thank you, presenters. We look forward to hearing more about this important intersection. There is no vote. We're going to pause now and take 10 minutes, and we'll resume the session this afternoon at 2:40 in 12 minutes. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Hello, folks. If you're there, please turn on your videos. Or your cameras, rather, sorry. We're going to start, we're going to begin the second session here. This is agenda item 2, the update Downsview study. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for participating. What we're about to review is a city study, and it's the second review of it. The title is Update Downsview. We have an hour and 30 minutes scheduled for the review. It's a formal review session, but there's no vote taken at the end because it's a study rather than an application. Staff have 40 minutes for their presentation and discussion to follow. The session is being live streamed on YouTube and also being recorded. The recording will be available on the City Planning YouTube channel following the meeting. I am now going to do the roll call. These panel members, as usual, confirm that you're participating in the review and that you don't have a conflict of interest on the project. I'm going to start with Michael Leckman.
Present and no conflict.
Dima Cook.
Present, no conflict.
Ralph Giannoni. Did he come back? Where's Ralph?
Don't see him.
No. All right. Okay. Jim Goff.
Present, no conflict.
Jim Melvin.
Present, no conflict.
Jessica Hutchin.
Present, no conflict.
And Joe Lobko.
Present, no conflict.
And have I missed anybody? No.
Meg, Ralph's camera is still showing that he is connected, so hopefully that means he also attends.
Yeah, thank you. I saw that. So I'm going to hope he comes back, and I will ask him at that time whether he has a conflict. So I may interrupt, or I'll do it. Actually, I'll do it through the chat probably. Okay. Some reminders before we get started. For panel members, please don't forget the staff questions and to always provide commentary on issues of both concern and appreciation. I will give a 1-minute verbal signal to when you've got 1 minute left, so that you can wrap up your presentation. And then let's go from there. We can begin with the presentation. And if you could please introduce yourselves before you begin to speak. Thank you. Oh, Ralph, wait, before I do, Ralph, hi. You're present. Please confirm you have no conflict. Did you say something? I can't see you.
No.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Sorry. Yes.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, my earbuds weren't on. No conflict.
Thank you. Okay, back to the staff, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. Can everyone see my screen properly, I hope? Perfect. So as you may recall, we were last here about a year ago to present on our emerging directions for the Update Downsview project. So looking forward to sharing where we are today. So I'll start with providing a bit of the study background and context, a bit of a recap from last time. And then we'll also have a bit of the heritage context, and then move on to the environmental assessment update. I'll be back with the draft secondary plan, and then PC will take us through the draft urban design guidelines. So the Update Downsview study sets out an updated vision and policy framework for the Downsview area to recognize all that has changed in the past decade or so. So this includes the planned departure of Bombardier from the airport lands in early 2024, which leaves a large area available for redevelopment. The study will bring forward 5 key deliverables that you can see there in the blue box to the left. So an updated secondary plan, a master environmental servicing plan, a community development plan, an area-specific zoning bylaw, and urban design guidelines. And all these are going to work together to direct the development of more detailed district plans and other applications in the area going forward. As you can see in the blue box, kind of the lower right part of the screen, some of this more detailed work is already ongoing. So we have an application in for a film studio, as well as the first district plan from Northcrest Developments, which is currently under review by the city. So the update Downsview and secondary plan areas, which are the same, are shown in the black line on this map, which is about 560 hectares. Generally, the boundaries are Keel Street to the west, Shepherd to the north, Allen Road and Wilson Heights Boulevard to the east, and Wilson and a bit of Highway 401 to the south. The city's estimated that at full build out, which is over 30 years, we're looking at about 60,000 units to house 110,000 people, and also 47,000 jobs in the area. The smaller blue area on the map is the area that's the focus of the official plan amendment application from Northcrest Developments and Canada Lands Company, and that proposal is being considered within the larger city study. So just to give a sense of scale of the secondary plan area in the context of North York, we're looking at about equivalent to from Highway 401 to Bayview Avenue, Finch, and Yonge, or looking at the downtown context, about the area bounded by Bloor, Jarvis, the Dida, and the rail corridor. So just to give a sense of how many buildings, blocks, roads, and public spaces can fit in this area. So we've been referring to Update Downsview really as building a city within a city to recognize such a significant new population that's anticipated in the area. So as I mentioned, we're looking at about 110,000 new residents, which is essentially introducing the population of the city of Brantford, Thunder Bay, or Waterloo in the Downsview area. So as I noted, the application by Northcrest and Canada Lands Company is being considered through the city's broader Update Downsview project. So as a result, there is ongoing close collaboration between the city team and the applicants as this work unfolds, since there's significant common ground in outlining a new vision for the Downsview area. So this has involved regular meetings and workshops on a range of topics. And of significance for urban design, there's been additional support in the preparation of the draft urban design guidelines, which BC will discuss later in the presentation. So while Update Downsview is a city-led project, the applicant team has also joined the city as co-proponents for the environmental assessment study work that's supporting this project. And again, that'll be discussed shortly. In addition to these two major landowners, our team's also engaging with the other landowners to understand their interests in the area. So Update Downsview launched at the beginning of 2022, and to date, we've had two staff reports, one in May of 2022, where we presented the emerging directions for the study area, and then again in April and May of this year, where city staff brought forward a draft of the secondary plan, as well as a status update of the other deliverables. So we're now at the beginning of phase 3 of this 3-phase project. And so over the next months, we're continuing to engage with the public on our draft documents, as well as revising and finalizing them and looking to submit the final documents to City Council in the spring of 2024. Just to give a sense of the engagement that we've been undertaking throughout Update Downsview, this slide provides a bit of an overview of the major events to date, as well as some that are upcoming, though certainly not a comprehensive list. So far, they've been, I'll say, 4 major milestones, being the public launch event in January 2022, followed by major events in the spring and then the fall of that same year. And then more recently, we had another virtual public meeting, in-person open house, and Indigenous sharing meeting this spring, with more engagement planned this summer and into the fall as we continue to refine our deliverables. We've certainly heard a wide range of input through these events so far, including things like the importance of maximizing green space, the need for facilities and programming, how hard it is to get around the area, the need for affordable housing, as well as concern regarding proposed revisions to the densities in the Allen East District, and that's the area that's just east of Allen Road. And so we're continuing to consider and work through this input, including having follow-up conversations as needed. So as a bit of a recap from our last presentation, this slide provides a few images of the Downsview area as it is today. So again, the larger area in the black line is the update Downsview study area, and the area in the red border is the official plan amendment area lands. So along the left-hand side, you'll see the Downsview Park TTC and GO station, and a couple images of the large supply depot building. And on the right-hand side, an image of the runway, a view of the Park Commons area, as well as one of the Bombardier hangars. So I think our team was experiencing some technical difficulties. I'm not sure if George is on the line.
I just arrived online.
Perfect. So I'll pass it on to Georgia.
Oh, what timing. Hello, everyone. My name is Georgia Cush. I'm the Senior Heritage Planner for City Planning, and we all know that the Downsview lands contain an important collection of buildings, structures, and landscapes that represent the aviation and the military history of Canada. But well before that, this large, flat expanse of land would have been occupied by Indigenous peoples for at least 11,000 years. And more recently, over the 20th century, the site expanded and evolved to include various activities such as aircraft manufacturing, active airfields, and CFB Downsview operations. Can you move to the next slide for me, please? Now, understanding the cultural heritage value of a place is really the bedrock of good planning, and the existing secondary plan identified a large number of buildings and structures that have cultural heritage value, and the majority of those resources were subsequently listed on the city's heritage register. The map on this slide shows the location of all the identified heritage structures, both within the new secondary plan review boundaries and the North Crest Development Application site. Heritage Planning's policy and research staff have assessed the few outstanding resources that were not listed, and now we have a clear understanding of the value of the Bombardier complex. And so we will be listing it on the Heritage Register in the coming months. And in order to be consistent with our standard practice, and in light of the restrictions that Bill 23 has on listed properties, staff will eventually recommend that the complex be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act as a way to ensure its long-term conservation. But that designation will occur in conjunction with the North Crest Development Application as it progresses. And finally, I just want to confirm that the Heritage Planning staff have been working with our colleagues in urban design to incorporate a meaningful heritage component into the urban design guidelines for Downsview. Thank you.
Perfect. So now I'm going to hand it off to Ed from our environmental assessment team.
Thanks, Jessica. My name is Edward Presta. I'm the Senior Project Manager representing Transportation Services. We also have planning staff that are working on this, and they can introduce themselves when their slides come up. So what we're dealing with here is a transportation master plan level of assessment, where we're considering 10% design level to understand feasibility, and with many of the recommendations requiring further EA study to determine the 30% design level. So what we started with was a long list of options, and they were assessed down to a selected preferred option through the evaluation criteria you see here. The major goals in the TMP portion are to provide connectivity, protect vulnerable users through design, and reduce auto dependency. And so the reduction in auto dependency is we approach it in a number of different ways. Two of them are creating a robust multimodal transportation system to get people to and from higher order transit opportunities that exist now and that will exist in the future, and to also consider reduced parking rates to get people out of their cars. Next slide, please. And Jessica, you might want to point to some things when I speak to them, if you could.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so basically what we looked at here, these fuchsia lines, B, D, G, and H2 are the major framework roads that are the subject of the transportation master plan. So no, that was the focus of the study. The preferred option obviously shows 2 north-south major roads and 2 east-west major roads. And all of these, we are looking at a multimodal approach. And so these rights of ways will contain roads that are specific in the lane configurations. We're trying to reduce lane widths to make crossing opportunities shorter and safer at intersections. And we are providing more robust transportation, pedestrian and cycling facilities. So what you will normally see on a typical city major road, those are a lot of those are retrofits, but we have an opportunity here to really create something that where people are much more comfortable walking and cycling through. I want you to also look at the green line just beside the road that's labeled G. And so on one side of it is a green line. That's called the green spine. It's not part of the TMP deliverable, but it is a multimodal path that will be relatively wide, 15 to 18 meters. And that will provide an opportunity for people to move through the site from Wilson all the way north to Shepherd. And then the runway in the middle will also be a number of things. One of them is going to be an event space, but it will also provide opportunities for pedestrians and cyclists to move through the area and they won't be impeded by automobiles on the runway because it will be pedestrian and cycling only. And then you can see the TTC stations. So we have 3 existing stations. We have the Wilson station on the south, Shepherd station midway up, and then the Downsview station. And Downsview is also supported by the GO station that exists there now. And as part of a TMP like this, we also look for opportunities to improve transit connectivity by protecting for and planning for future transit opportunities. So you'll see on the bottom that black GO sign, that's a potential Wilson GO station. So we are protecting for that. We're not doing a lot of planning for it right now, but it is a dot on the map for future study. And then we're also planning for the Shepherd West extension at Shepherd Station. So those are all opportunities that we're pursuing as part of the TMP. And then you'll see the various rights of way on the left side of the screen. And so we are looking at cross sections for these major roads, anywhere from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. And you'll see on the top one, there is the opportunity to consider major transit opportunities that maybe there'll be HOV lanes, there might be bus only lanes with general traffic in the middle. So that is being considered now, and through future environmental studies, which will start next year, we will delve more deeply into where transit should go and what it should look like. And then we're also looking at not just the site itself, but we're looking beyond the site. And so we're considering within the site, we have cycling opportunities and pedestrian opportunities, but they need to connect to the larger area because people won't use the cycling opportunities internally as much as if we provide those connections north, east, west, and south. And so 2 good examples of this are Dufferin between Highway 401 and where Dufferin ends just north of Wilson. We are looking at that. There's likely going to be a widening of Dufferin to accommodate all the vulnerable uses that we need within that right of way. And we need to make sure it connects appropriately to what's south of 401, what we have planned for Dufferin, and what we have planned for Street G, which is more or less called the Dufferin extension. So it has to be a blend of what's happening through their area. So we're looking beyond the site to understand that. And then just above the Wilson symbol, the Wilson TTC symbol, there's a dotted line, dash line, the black dash line. And that dash line represents some planning that we're doing to potentially realign Transit Road as it connects to Wilson, the Billy Bishop extension, which is G. So there's offsite improvements that are needed to connect to what we're doing on site. If you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this basically is an illustration of the rail crossing opportunities that we're going to be looking at. And so obviously the Barrie Rail Corridor is a barrier. And so there are 5 crossings planned here. 3 of them are for pedestrian and cyclists only, and 2 of them are multimodal. So they include cars, pedestrian, cycling, and transit. And so these pedestrian cycling, multimodal crossing opportunities really go a long way towards reducing auto dependency, and that being one of the goals contained within the TMP. And I'm done.
So Tyler, I think it's up to you now.
Certainly. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Tyler Lasko, working within the city's planning group, and along with the transportation elements, along with the further to the transportation elements, water, sanitary, and stormwater are additional infrastructure analysis that are underway as part of this project. This relates to the major components of each of these systems, and this work is also being completed within the municipal Class EA process, identifying the needs, opportunities, and recommended major solutions to serve the growth. The project is looking to and investigating a series of water and sanitary system improvements, along with the objective of achieving reductions in water usage and discharge. As I said earlier, the work is subject to further review through consultation processes into the summer and fall of this year. Similarly, stormwater management is also being assessed for a much more naturalized approach to rainfall events and drainage through coordinated green infrastructure within the Downsview area. Green infrastructure refers to systems and tools that use or mimic natural processes to more sustainably manage stormwater runoff. Traditional approaches to stormwater tend to treat and outlet water quickly while diverting it from where it falls. Green infrastructure systems promote infiltration, evapotranspiration, and reuse to protect water quality and at the same time promote urban biodiversity. So some examples of green infrastructure can include existing natural heritage features, parklands, street trees, urban forests, permeable surfaces, naturalized channels, green roofs. These are the types of tools and this does its part to achieve a more holistic and comprehensive decentralized stormwater management approach. So similar to water and sanitary, this project work is subject to further review through consultation processes into the summer and fall of this year. But this update is a reminder of where these specific major project elements are headed. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. So now I'm going to dive into the draft secondary plan. So given the plan area is so large, what we're doing is setting out the structuring framework for the whole area now. And then as development occurs, there'll be requirements for district plans for smaller areas to lay out how those smaller areas will be developed. So at this scale, and we're looking at kind of the first column here on the screen, we're setting out things like the major roads as Ed laid out for us, rail crossings, major parks, densities, and kind of the big components of the public realm system. Whereas the district plans will focus on the local road network, local parks, building types, locations, and sizes. So the draft Downsview secondary plan outlines a new vision for the area, which is guided by the 2 overarching goals of climate resilience and sustainability and achieving equitable outcomes. So these goals provide the umbrella under which all of the objectives and policies of the plan fall under and to help achieve. And the Downsview area provides an incredible opportunity to really embed these goals from the very beginning. And we drafted the plan based on the recognition that these goals are interconnected and that both are necessary to develop truly successful and inclusive communities. We have 13 objectives to support those 2 goals. And so to better communicate their intent, we've grouped them into these 4 buckets. So reducing barriers to success is about ensuring that all current and future residents and workers are supported in accessing what they need, including jobs, housing, services, and recognizing the challenges to overcome and achieving an equitable community. Livable communities is about focusing on really high quality public spaces and making sure that we're building complete communities really emphasizing a high quality of life. Climate resilience is where we're referring to supporting strategies such as net zero emissions, promoting ways to get around other than driving, and building those connections to nature. And finally, the last bucket is about highlighting the enduring Indigenous presence and recognizing the cultural heritage and diversity of the area, making sure we design really unique public spaces. And then the next series of slides just provide an overview of the big policy moves in the draft secondary plan, as well as some of the maps. So start off with looking at a high quality public realm. So the draft policies direct the creation of connected green space system with 8 new major parks, a green spine, which Ed already mentions, that's the turquoise line here, and the runway as major structuring elements, providing connections throughout the site. So the runway and taxiway, so the runway is this kind of blue line, the taxiway is the shorter gray line, are intended to be really unique, publicly accessible pedestrian spaces. And the runway is 2.1 kilometers long to give a sense of the scale. And so we're really looking at maintaining the linearity of their historic uses. The public realm is also going to be a space for celebrating Indigenous cultures and creating space for arts and culture. And we're looking at extending connections beyond the planned boundaries as well. For example, looking at extending the green spine south to the just north of Highway 401, where there is a potential pedestrian bridge identified in the Yorkdale Transportation Master Plan to the south to try to build those connections. And then you can just see here the 8 major parks are identified, circled in red. And so responding to climate emergencies again is another one of the big themes here. So because of the scale of the Downsview area, there is a significant potential to implement innovative strategies for responding to the climate emergency and to support the city's net zero emissions target. So some of the strategies that are outlined in the plan include encouraging low carbon energy production, including district energy, mitigating the impact of embodied carbon, both in built form as well as public realm. And as Tyler mentioned, implementing a decentralized stormwater management approach, so creating more nature-based solutions. The Downsview area includes significant barriers to mobility as it is now, as Ed described. So breaking down these barriers, providing more options is a key to the vision for the area. So I'll try not to repeat too much of what Ed already said, but you can see the major streets identified through the EA in the yellow here, as well as the proposed crossings of the rail line. And so the plan does look at prioritize walking, biking, and transit for most daily trips, supported by a complete streets approach, improved transit, and breaking down those barriers with the new rail crossings and a new street network, as well as other routes such as the runway and the green spine. And as I mentioned earlier, the local streets will come through the more detailed district plan process. And there you can see the 5 new rail crossings circled in red. So in terms of built form and land use, much of the lands where we're expecting significant development are either mixed use in the red, parks, or general employment in the purple. So the plan encourages a full range of housing options, and that includes a minimum of 40% of the housing to have at least 2 bedrooms, and directs higher densities near the transit stations. And we're also looking at ensuring that there are appropriate transitions to adjacent communities, but there are not a significant number of built form policies in the secondary plan as it is at such a high level. So looking at exploring that a bit more in the urban design guidelines as well as through the district plan process where we'll have smaller areas to look at. As I mentioned, we are directing the higher densities towards the transit stations. You'll see the highest areas in pink, 3.5 FSI, near the 3 transit stations, and these are gross densities, just to clarify that. And with this projected population being introduced over the next 30 years, we know that there are some community services facilities we need based on conversations internally, as well as with school boards and the library. So looking at, for instance, at least 2 community recreation centers, 20 to 30 childcare centers, about a dozen new schools, a library, community agency space, as well supported by a whole range of retail spaces. And we also have phasing in place to ensure that jobs are being created in coordination with housing, so one is not being front-ended over the other. So in terms of the framework for implementation, as I mentioned, the next step will be district plans. District plans will be required prior to development proceeding, and that's again a fully public a fully public process. And you can see on the right at the map, we've identified 15 districts, and a few of them, some work has already begun. And because development is anticipated to take around 30 years over multiple phases, there are opportunities also for interim uses. So that's something we're looking at in the draft secondary plan, as well as in implementing zoning. So looking at uses that can help animate the site in the meantime, provide local amenities, retail uses, services, and build the connections to break down those barriers that have been around for so long, and create additional opportunities for green space. So now I'm going to pass it on to PC to take us through the draft urban design guidelines.
And just to note that you have about 11 minutes left.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
Hi everyone, sorry, I'm PC Vassman, the Senior Urban Designer for Downsview. Let me just move on to the next slide, sorry, there we go. So the urban design guidelines are being developed alongside with this secondary plan and are refining the principles and policy into guidelines that will help to implement the secondary plan goals. The urban design guidelines are also a few steps behind the secondary plan in the process on being adapted as the plan evolves through engagement and meetings, and they're still at quite a high level at this point. The urban design guidelines also will also be considering action items raised by the community development plan as guidelines where possible. Let's see if I can, there we go. So because the secondary plan area is so large, and smaller scale district plans will be required, these urban design guidelines will remain relatively high level with a focus on key structuring elements. The urban design guidelines will build upon the policy's key goals and objectives set out by the secondary plan, providing more detail on key urban design features and ideas. So similar in structure to the secondary plan, the urban design guidelines will be organized according to update Downsview's unique structuring elements, and additional area-wide guidelines will pertain to the overall plan and guide common characteristics relevant to good urban design. So this is one of the first structuring elements, the runway. The most prominent of these elements, which will have a minimum width of 20 meters along its entire eastern edge, spilling into wider spaces of up to 60 meters in places. It's envisaged to be accessible and comfortable in all seasons, and buildings adjacent to the runway will consider wind, sun, and other microclimatic conditions. Mobility along the runway will be primarily passive and will connect indirectly to transit stations through wayfinding. Public art will also be located in specific spaces as determined by the public art strategy, which is also ongoing in process. So another structuring element is the green spine. The green spine will function as both a linear north-south mobility route, as mentioned before, for pedestrians and cyclists, as well as a green infrastructure corridor. The green spine will connect with mobility routes outside of the plan area and provide benefit to residents and transit groups as a green mobility space linking to parks and other public spaces. The taxiway will link the Hangar District or Taxiway West to the Runway District and Nexus Park, which is the large park that you will see in the middle of this plan over here, and will be treated as a pedestrian priority space. The taxiway will act as a linear open space between public spaces, squares, and parks. So for the sorry, I went one to the build form. So for the build form, this is an area-wide. These will be area-wide guidelines, and as per the secondary plan mapping, higher density will be allowed near transit stations. Different city block layouts, sizes, and orientation will inform development and building envelopes. Contextual conditions adjacent to and within the plan, such as existing heritage neighborhoods, such as the Ancaster neighborhood to the south, will be considered in build form and design. Build form will also need to consider wind impacts and mitigation measures, as well as access to the sun and particular microclimatic conditions that may arise from cumulative build form effects. We're still in discussion about what mid-scale means specifically and how this will translate into in and through the different scales, such as this large scale, district plan scale, and then block scale as well. The ravine underpass will be explored through the design guidelines. The green east-west connection along the rail corridor connecting Downsview Park with the plan area east of the railway. This section is still largely in development as transportation planning discussions are still underway. So there's still quite a lot to be developed in the design guidelines, and just please take note that there will be an overall consideration as both upfront statements and embedded guidelines through throughout the urban design guidelines for heritage and commemoration, indigenous placekeeping, as well as city nature. And these items that are on the slide are being developed with the heritage team, as George has mentioned, and throughout the engagement process of the community development plan. And I think I will hand it over back to Jessica. Thank you.
Thanks, PC. So I'll just put up the questions that we have prepared to help to provide some areas where we would love to get some feedback. But of course, any feedback is much appreciated.
Thank you, team. I'm going to do, as the chair, a quick summary of the information presented and also a summary of the main points from the first review of the project 11 months ago. So this is the draft secondary plan area under consideration right now is 560 hectares, build out anticipated over 30 years, with a population increase projected at 110,000. The OPA area within it is 210 hectares, and that's Canada Lands in Northcrest. Engagement with local landowners and the public is ongoing throughout the city work in this area. Two overarching goals of the work undertaken by the city is to create climate resilience and sustainability through the planning and achieve equitable outcomes. Next steps are the creation of district plans, 15 of them. Notes from the previous review 11 months ago, these were the big takeaways: that more fine grain development was needed. Panel asked the city to look at increasing setbacks for wider boulevards, creating more open space, more interconnections, creating strength of connections, and distinctiveness of character and landscape identity. Those were some of the major points. So with that, we're going to go into panel discussion. We have 35 minutes and there are 7 of us, so that means 5 minutes each, but don't feel the need to take all that time should you not need it. We are going to go in the following order. Michael?
Madam Chair.
Sorry, yes.
There might be a few minutes for questions of clarification.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You're right. I missed that and I highlighted it. Please go ahead. Who has a question? Hands up. Got so excited I moved on. Jim Melvin.
Thank you, Meg. I
Yeah.
have I have a whole bunch of questions, and it's partly related to scale because I'm trying to wrap my head around it. But um, on something like the taxiway, is the intention that the taxiway has buildings fronting it, and would those buildings also front Billy Bishop? What's it called? Billy Bishop Way. Like like I can't get the scale of how big the space is between Taxiway, Billy Bishop Way, and Billy Bishop Way, and the what's the green line? The green, what's it called? The green spine.
Green spine.
Are all of those supposed to be treated with buildings fronting them, or the rear of buildings to the spine and to the taxiway? And Mr.
I
Ross?
can start if anyone wants to add on. Thank you for those questions. Yes, the scale is something that we definitely have had to adjust to in doing this project. The intention is that there would be buildings facing onto the runway as well as Billy Bishop and the Dufferin extension. In terms of the exact layout, whether there's laneways between those buildings, where local streets would go, that sort of thing will not be determined at this scale. We're looking at just those framework streets with local streets coming in through the district plans. The green spine, that might be a bit of a different context. PC, I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Well, I can. So Jim, that's actually a very good question, because the scale is quite, it's vast, right? So we're also going to have district scale plans as well as urban design guidelines that would speak to that. But with regard to the green spine itself, I think we would definitely want a positive interface onto the green spine, that whether it be residential or whatever kind of land use it might be, just to also activate that and make it a safe space as well as comfortable for users, right? So that is definitely being considered in the urban design guidelines, and also definitely within the specific districts that will front onto either the Dufferin extension, well, Billy Bishop Way, as well as the green spine. So I don't know if that provides you with somewhat of an answer at the scale.
That helps. A couple other questions, Meg. Quick,
Okay.
quickly. One is, what is the projected parkland ratio to per person population? You've got eight new pieces of park, and you got 110,000 people coming. How many square meters per park do you get for? Because I don't know the size of the parks.
Not to put her on the spot, but I know Natasha is on the line. I don't know if she has that number handy.
Hi there. My name is Natasha Petzold. I'm the project officer working on the parks planning team for Downsview. I don't know if I can give you the exact answer. The overall parkland numbers more or less in flux at this point. The plan that's in front of us is showing 8 major parks with about 14 hectares of parkland, each park ranging in size from 1 to 4 hectares. So as we move through the development application process, we'll be guided by parkland dedication rates per the legislation that's in place at the time.
Thanks, Natasha. That's helpful.
Great.
Okay, thank you. Michael Ekman, then Ralph, then Dima, please.
Chair, maybe some yes/no questions here. Is there an intent to include in the draft secondary plan heritage focal points as part of defining elements of the public realm? I'm thinking about the distillery and brickworks and others as examples of where that's a focal point.
At this point, we haven't identified, in terms of mapping specific heritage landmarks. Our approach has been recognizing that the need to incorporate heritage commemoration in the public realm, as well as maximizing the approaches to heritage buildings and relying on the official plan policies. PC, I don't know if you want to add anything with respect to the urban design guidelines, but certainly there would also be more detail done through the district plan process.
Jessica, all I can say with regard to that is yes, urban design guidelines will definitely take into consideration the heritage buildings and also views of them, sightlines, and also just to note that we are also taking into consideration the actual runway and the taxiway as existing context in whatever capacity, whether it's heritage or not. And I don't know, maybe Georgia can speak further to that with regard to the runway and the taxiway specifically, but we will definitely be considering that at later stages in scale, district scale and urban design guidelines at that stage.
Two more quick questions. First one is it anticipated that there'll be no change to the core and general employment areas that bound the site east and west?
There will be no change to the core employment areas. The general employment area designation was not a defined line in the site and area specific policy. That was the basis for the secondary plan, and through the secondary plan, that line has been defined.
Is the green spine understood to be a transition zone between the employment areas and the residential areas?
I think, yeah, the green spine is planned to be between the core employment areas, which is the TTC Wilson Yard and Department of Defense lands, as between that and the rest of the development.
One last question, Meg, does the current level of design prevent you from doing a comprehensive illustrative plan as opposed to a diagrammatic plan, just because of the level of work that you're going in? It as a visually oriented group, all of these layers, do they ever get consolidated into one beautiful plan?
It's not something we have prepared right now. I mean, it's something we can take back to see if that's feasible. But at this point, we have kept them as separate maps. So happy to hear input on that.
Thanks for tolerating me, Meg and team.
Yeah. So Ralph, Dima, and Joe, but please, short questions if you could. Ralph? Are you on mute?
Great. Yeah, sorry. I was asking the same question about the employment areas. Just wondering if the employment areas are anticipated any block division of those core areas, or that those would be separate applications to start seeing how some of those spaces could have improved connectivity from the surrounding context or through future built form context. And then the second question was schools, libraries, locations of those, anticipation on how those will be acquired or located. 12 schools, assuming some community centers and libraries for 110,000 people.
So to answer the first question, the kind of transition between general employment area and the mixed use area, for instance, in this this location will be refined through the district planning process. That's where we'll look at like the local street and exactly how the buildings work together. We're not anticipating any new development or changes in uses for the core employment areas here. To answer the question about community service facilities, we are not anticipating being able to map those facilities at this stage, just because we are at such a high level scale. We don't know where the local streets are going to be, for instance, but certainly we are looking to see if it makes sense to go into a bit more detail in terms of phasing, for instance, of where certain facilities might make sense, but that work is ongoing. So at this point, we just identified what the needs are.
Sorry, Meg, I just have one super quick question. The taxiway and the runway are POPs spaces, privately owned, not publicly accessible?
The runway, discussions are ongoing, but it's anticipated that would be a privately owned space with an easement or some sort of agreement on it. So yeah.
Thank you. Dima, and then Joe.
Two quick questions, I hope. One is just to go back to that question of phasing. I was trying to understand whether the planned parks correspond to the district plans that are going forward. So if it's being phased and a district plan gets developed, do all the district plans get a park associated with them? And then related, does the runway get built early on? How does that get gradually built out? What is the district plan prioritization phasing based on who is going to take up the lands and develop them?
We do have a phasing slide, so I'm just going to scroll really quickly to that as a
I may
bonus
have,
slide.
yeah, I have, okay.
To begin kind of an answer, I would say not every district has a district park in it, although they are distributed across the area. But I'll ask if Ed wants to discuss how phasing will unroll.
Sure, I can speak to the infrastructure phasing and just some sort of high-level principles that we are working through. So we haven't finalized it, and we're a little bit of ways off, but the major roads will be delivered as districts progress. And so you'll see, or you probably know that a number of districts are either going through the planning process or approaching it, and those are the ones at the periphery of the site. And so they don't rely on any internal major roads so that they can take access from Wilson or Shepherd, for instance. But as the internal districts start coming through, then whatever we've planned for through the upcoming environmental assessments, those will be included as part of the delivery of those districts. And so the initial districts that are adjacent to major roads, some of them do have elements of the major road system that we spoke to today. And so those will be delivered early on, and there'll just be a piece of infrastructure waiting to be connected right through as the other districts progress. And we have we're looking at this in 10-year increments. It seems that over 30 years, within the first 10 years, some of this infrastructure will be delivered. And then the next 10 years, we'll see additional infrastructure as the districts are coming through. And then there's the final 10 years. What we are going to try to do is avoid the major infrastructure ending in a cul-de-sac so that through the districts, we'll be able to loop cars around and back to the major roads that exist now. Yeah, I think that answers that question.
I think Natasha might add a little bit more on the parks.
Yeah, I can jump in just quickly. So each individual district may not have a major park that was identified on the plan Jessica had on the screen previously, but we do anticipate that there may be some local parks that come online in relation to the development applications that come forward. So those will not be necessarily designated parks, but those districts will not lack green space. And then just to speak to the overall strategy or the system of parks and open space, it's distributed based on approximately a 5-minute walking distance. So each resident or employee within the area has access to a major green space within a 5-minute walking distance.
I'm sorry, Meg, just my second quick question is in your climate, one of the major goals of this project seems to be climate resilience, except I'm curious about your wording. It seems a bit weak, if I may say. Encourage district energy, like on a site of this scale, why isn't district energy rooted and mandatory? Like it seems like from the city's perspective or even Canada Lands, that should be the root of, like, this is the opportunity to actually implement some pretty significant infrastructure that would support the neighborhood, that would be green right from the get-go.
Yes, it is certainly one of our major goals, and certainly the exact wording of the draft policies is still being refined. To a certain extent, we are limited in what we can require through the Planning Act, so we are trying to push boundaries where we can, and we are working with North Crescent Canada Lands Company to forward some of these goals in various ways. But I mean, I definitely hear you, and certainly we will be trying to push boundaries where we can in that area.
Joe.
Thank you. My question is on the drawing on the screen now, that large purple triangle in the middle, which includes the historic heart of Downsview and all of the heritage buildings that Michael alluded to earlier as potentially giving historic character to the place, are not one of the districts that are included in this work. In other words, the historic heart that gives the place its identity now is actually not part of the focus of the work. I think I know why, but I'm going to ask why not? And how do you integrate the planning of all these new districts with its historic core if they're not on the table together at the same time?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The reason that this purple area, or I guess it's called the Park Commons, was not identified as a district is because we were not anticipating a significant amount of new development in terms of new buildings, new roads to occur in this area. And therefore, we did not identify that a comprehensive plan was required in the way that a district plan is required for some of the more vacant areas. But certainly ensuring the connectivity is there is important, and we can continue to take a look at our policy to make sure that is reflected. So it's definitely helpful to hear, but that was the reasoning behind it not being identified as a district.
All right, thank you, everybody. We're going to go into panel discussion at this point. We'll use the order that we used for roll call. Michael, Dima, Ralph, Jim Goff, Jim Melvin, Jessica, and then Joe, please. Michael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to answer or make my comments in the order of the questions, I think. I'm going to see if I can put them up on the screen for myself here. Or maybe you can. That'd be great. Yeah. Thank you. So the question is, high-level structuring plan for Downsview, are we addressing the right elements? Yes, I would say, strongly. Although one of the things that emerges from the conversations that we've had is that this is a very long, narrow swath of development that has intrinsic challenges, especially since it's got employment lands on both sides. It's got its linear quality and its lack of, I would say, density depth on either side of the main streets is intriguing. I know they're at a very early stage, but I think about the urban structure of Toronto generally, especially in the downtown, long, deep neighborhood blocks that feed main streets with short blocks on them. And that is obviously we know is a good recipe for success. We've had about 20 years of development of long, narrow swaths adjacent to the railway lands and other places. And maybe there are some lessons learned about the successful development of main streets in those areas. I live in those areas, and I know that there is definitely community feel, but there are lessons to be learned that can be applied here. And I do hope that more knowledge and can be gleaned from those areas that we've developed that can be applied here. The second question is, does the proposed plan support strong connections? I would say yes. I'm curious about the residential streets north of Wilson that in the Northcrest plan did show some continuity. In this plan, do not show continuity in the south end of the site. And I just wonder about that as one more layer of potential neighborhood continuity. Next question, unique open spaces that have varying ownership structures under discussion. Good examples of successful privately owned public spaces. I was just in London, and there are two significant areas, King's Cross, including Coldrop Yard, and Central St. Giles is another one that are privately owned public spaces. Lots of debate about them, but what seems to be overriding is that when they're done at an extremely high quality, a lot of their problems seem to be lessened. So I would say one can look very closely at Coal Drop Yards and the King's Cross neighborhood for high quality urban design made possible through the public spaces that are privately owned. And then finally, do the draft guidelines put a significant shift toward, implement a significant shift towards auto and transit, so away from auto towards transit. With the number of transit stations on the site, it certainly seems highly likely. Are there ways of promoting or discouraging vehicle use? Again, think about London, where they've got taxes for using the central downtown, but they also have incentives for using EVs downtown. Is there a way to think about encouraging or further discouraging vehicle use to its absolute minimum? And we've got a great example on King Street, which is that the cross section permits but doesn't encourage continuous vehicular use through the whole site. So that would be one thing. And then my final would be that the runway at 60 meters in width, very exciting to think about the full width of the runway being available. The urban edges, I would say, when we get to that point, need to be developed with some strong self-sufficiency, because obviously the sparks that create good urban space that allow you to cross from one side to the other aren't there. So consider the strong self-sufficiency of the edges. And as I've asked during my question, I would strongly encourage that a comprehensive plan be drawn that includes all of the great ideas shown today, and that would help propagate the excitement about a whole new city on Downsview. Thanks very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Michael. Dima.
Thank you for the presentation. I think I can, like others, like the scale of this project is kind of very interesting to get my head around. And one of the things that's I'm maybe perplexed by is the phasing strategy for the major roads. So much of the success or the planning that has been shown seems to really benefit from the connections to the subway stations, to the new GO stations, and yet those connections may not exist for another 30 years if some of those roads are not fully built out. I would certainly encourage, if I understood it correctly, like a prioritization of actually building those connections. And you were talking about interim conditions, so maybe they just become huge linear parks or just bike lanes to get people to subways, but having some way of fully benefiting from the full transit on the site rather than waiting till it's fully built out, I would think is fairly essential. The runway is a massively long infrastructure. If it's also, again, going to be built out over 30 years, I think that too cannot be part of individual district plans. It needs to be, I would think that it would need to actually be cut out and have its own overriding and overarching character and understanding so that it is understood as to how it's going to progress and interconnect and develop as a continuous long piece, rather than maybe more piecemeal, so that there's a sense of planning of continuity and as it gets phased out and as it gets developed. I think I would agree with Joe. There's some connection to the heritage parts of the area that should be stronger, so that part of, because those buildings are really unique, and tying into the functions that are there, sort of for the schools and the other recreational functions, are key assets in the neighborhood as well. It's an incredible benefit to have those kind of facilities in a residential and employment neighborhood and easily accessible. And then looking at the environmental and climate goals, I mean, that is one of the overarching pieces in this project, but I don't really think the policies are there yet. And like encouraging people to do something, I think the city should be really looking at taking the lead and requiring things. I know there'll be more, embodied energy requirements with the Toronto Green standards that are coming into play, but by the time this project's built out, our standards for climate, our standards for environment will have radically changed. So I think that needs to be thought about, like not where we are now in our standards, but where we will be in 30 years, so that we are not building in a kind of obsolescent approach to climate and water and energy production and waste production into the project. I think there's a lot of opportunities that can be embedded right now, even if their implementation is over a long period of time. But there are a lot of decisions now that may make it impossible to implement some critical features in the future. So I would certainly encourage the team to look at what we're going to be in 30 years and think of that as how do we allow a really forward-thinking climate approach to what the building guidelines are going to be, what the water management guidelines are going to be, and certainly what energy and carbon production and conservation is going to also be. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dima. Ralph. You're on mute if you're talking.
Well, that's a third time today. Okay, I apologize. A lot's already been said that I would have said. I think, of course, sustainability. I mean, I think we'd be incredibly aggressive to think that this is a 30-year plan. It's enormous, and I think it's going to be longer. So I would think that sustainability in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years is the goal here, and to really embrace that specifically here as a kind of key, unbelievable opportunity in the city of Toronto to add 110,000 people here. So I also think that as we've seen and we're continuing to see, the notion of employment is something that I think needs to be considered. What does that mean? What is core employment presently? What is it in 10 years? And then of course, the general employment area specifically, I guess, is one that I'm kind of scratching my head in, because it clearly it has both physical, experiential conditions that affect the overall public realm experience, specifically along Dundas Street at the north of Downsview Park Boulevard, where you have, one side of the street being general employment, the other side of the street being mixed use. What is that vision for that, and why can we not look at maybe thinking about employment differently, and maybe there's a blur, and that there's not a hard line, and that the hard line, and I was kind of bolstered by the study, I think the Keel St. Clair study, where there's this idea potentially of sprinkling in a kind of smudging of employment and mixed use neighborhoods. And I also think that there is a lot of mixed use red here. And that's also something that's kind of, I'm scratching my head, understanding, well, what does that mean? Of course, it's a very general designation, allowing for flexibility. But then is there any hierarchy at all in terms of what mixed use areas are which? And it's very interesting because clearly the parks along the runway have very specific shapes. Clearly, a lot of attention is being brought by North Press to create those spaces. It'd be very interesting to see how at this level we can make sure that those spaces that are created are going to be successful. I don't understand the runway exactly. I don't know what kind of, is it a residential space? Is it a commercial space? Is it a retail space? As opposed to Dufferin Street, which might be more, I'm going to say, what we're used to in terms of a mixed use experience where multiple uses come together. Also, I'm trying to find a scale that is, where is the kind of node shopping area? It just seems like the moves are so big, so strange proportionally, that I just wonder whether, you know, how much butter do we have to spread on the toast in terms of experience. And again, I think that that's something that has to be looked at. So I would say that the mixed use slash employment relationships and start thinking about the future of those experiences that clearly we're now dealing with presently in the city, and whether we go back to maybe what looks like something that was more pre-COVID designations, and that could be something that could be really quite unique in embracing a new way of working in employment. Equally, the notion of the runway, I think I completely agree. It is, the scale of it is so large that I think some thought has to be given to what it is and how it creates different distinct areas. And I know maybe this is too early, but I do think that that's a big move and requires some really, really strong direction. And of course, I know again it's at the district level, but this very long, and again, I think Michael hit the nail on the head. This long, stretched out sausage of a mixed use swath that goes north south. Again, I conceptually have no problem with it, but maybe it's just because the core employment area and the general employment area are kind of like, you know, the kind of brackets that don't allow it to kind of expand and create a kind of interaction with it. And of course, the Greenway as well, which has single loaded against core employment and mixed use, still don't quite understand what that space is and how it buffers or just creates a wonderful opportunity to integrate core employment and mixed use. That's it.
Thank you, Jim Goff. Jim, you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I just unmuted. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks very much, everyone, for the presentation. I agree with a lot of what's been said, particularly what Ralph was just saying about this being such a big area and how things will evolve over time, and I'm quite sure they will. You know, I was involved with the district plan for the area on the other side of the Allen around the Shepherd West station, and you know, we worked on that for probably, actually, our company worked on that for like 20 years, and the plan certainly evolved over time. So the plans here will continue to evolve as well, I'm sure. But I think, as we said earlier today regarding Jane Finch, you need to dream big with it being such a big area. It is absolutely a unique opportunity in the city. So, you know, I would try to just pile as many big ideas in there as possible to create focal points and ways to really create something that is pedestrian and transit oriented. Just going through the questions. I think the approach makes sense, and I think you've talked to all the points that are needed for that. In terms of the plan supporting strong connections with the surrounding communities, yeah, I think the road network has been given a lot of thought over the years, and that certainly makes a lot of sense in terms of the connections and knitting the community together across the rail corridor, which I think is absolutely essential to making it sustainable in terms of mobility and just more livable as well, and to create that kind of inward-looking, unique place. In terms of the open spaces, I think, you know, one thing I would like to see, being somebody who just loves trees and is concerned about the city's tree canopy, is like, I think I would like to see a stronger mention of treed areas. Why not have a Downsview forest somewhere? You know, when I go by this area, it just does seem like a large open field in a lot of ways, and that's understandable given what used to be there. But now there's the opportunity to really change that and reimagine it as something new. And I think in 50 years, creating that kind of forest there could be something that is as great as a way to have fought against the climate emergency and to try to make it more sustainable and green. And as Dima said earlier, I think The plan absolutely should be very strong in terms of green infrastructure, such as requiring district energy and other green ideas to make this a model for the city and to make it as sustainable as possible. And I think the last question also was something Dima raised regarding the question of how do you develop that orientation to transit if the roads are going to be developed district by district. And I think that may be a hindrance or a possible challenge as the plan develops and as the jigsaw pieces fall into place. So I think there needs to be some really good detailed thought about how you do stage the roads and stage them to create that orientation to transit, linking to the various subway stations and the GO stations. Finally, I do think the street designs are quite appropriate in terms of the sustainability goals. They certainly don't oversupply traffic capacity, which is good. Having a network of 2-lane and 4-lane roads, I think, is definitely the way to go to encourage people to use the alternative modes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jessica?
Sure. Sorry. I think Jim Melvin was next, but
Yeah, you're right. I'm really not doing a good job today. Jim?
So I'll go instead of Jessica.
No, well, Jessica will just go after you. That's all.
So I'll go.
Yes.
Okay. Jim Goff, I was involved in planting the Downsview forest 20 years ago. It's just slow to grow in the parkland. This is a really tough project to get my head around and scale. But I think that the parks, as you've got them laid out, and I believe 1 to 4 hectare park systems, maybe some should be a little bigger, but with all of the other open space, the runway and the green spine, there's plenty of open space for the new population, so that's really healthy. I think the parks themselves should be used as a identity for the communities or the districts, and each park, depending on what happens in that park, I can imagine some will be sports fields and some will be just really nice places to go and see plants, and some will be nature reserves, but the park itself and the district surrounding the park, as Ralph just said, he can't find a heart for the project. I think each park is a heart for the district, and the project is so big, it doesn't have one heart, it has 8 hearts, let's say, because of the and I think that would be important as you move forward to talk a lot about what the nature of the parks are and the open spaces are. And along with that, the runway, although it's graphically shown as a 2.4 meter or 2.4 kilometer long straight line, it's not. It's a 2.4 kilometer long line interrupted by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parks. So the space of the runway can change between each park because the park is going to interrupt the nature of what the runway is. I believe that the landscape of the park should dominate over the runway. And that might be sacrilegious against those who think a 2.4 meter runway is a nod to history. I don't think it is. I think that the nature of the runway then can become change and different as you move through each of the districts, and that will as well help describe the houses around it and the type of housing. It could just help describe where the schools and those elements go. Even the district heating plants or energy plants. The green spine, I have a little concern that it becomes a back of house space. But if it can be used for some of your stormwater management, then I think the back of house nature of it and the separation as a separation barrier between land uses can become quite lovely. And if buildings are going to face on it, retail faces the green spine, it could become one of the most unique places in Toronto to interact with nature and do some of your commerce retail stuff. I was saddened to hear that the runway is being proposed as a pop space. I don't think it should be a pop space. It should act as a kind of space like the Bentway. And if it has that programmed nature to it, then the governance of the space you might want to investigate is more a conservancy, so that there is a group of people who are responsible for what that space is. And the group isn't building owners, it's people users, it's the users. So I would advocate conservancy kind of a space for that. The accessibility on the site, I noticed that there are 2 overpasses proposed, and I'm wondering how that will deal for pedestrian overpasses over the rail, how that will become accessible. And then I see a beautiful underpass image that has stormwater management ideas associated with it. But as well, that's also where H2 Road is going through. So I don't know how you marry the sustainability of the walkable underpass with the nature of the H2 Road. So I would hope that there's some more study going on with that. I think that's basically my comments for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your presentation. I appreciate the amount of work that's gone into this plan, and there's certainly been a lot of great comments so far. I'll start my comments with praise for the inclusion of nature-based solutions in your presentation today. The green spine is described in the document as supporting green infrastructure. And I would argue and encourage for a shift in thinking and language to ensure that it's not just supportive of green infrastructure, but that it itself is considered holistically as an infrastructural asset. You know, it's a lot harder to impinge on infrastructural corridors than it is on green ones. So I think it's just a bit of a language shift, and that's going to help in as we move through the next 30, 50 years to secure these as, you know, viable parts of our infrastructure. I'd also like to see broader consideration for green infrastructure throughout the plan. It's deemed as a key structuring element, but, you know, physiologically speaking, the spine is a structure with sort of many connections to bones and nerves. So how could this green spine sort of expand its influence? Furthermore to that, I think ensuring enough space to achieve the various goals of green infrastructure is important as well. And that includes, as Jim Goff mentioned, you know, urban tree canopies and the space that they actually need to develop long-term substantial growth. And then I think there's an interesting question, the sort of final 4th question about what elements of that green spine should be secured in the first phase. And I would suggest all of it, or as much of it as possible. You know, again, thinking about how that spine can contribute over time. I'm talking about like pre-build out to full build out, whether it's 30 or 50 years, and making it so that it's flexible enough to adapt to those new technologies. As Dima mentioned, things are going to change. We're going to have new strategies for sustainability. But I think if you can secure it, make it big enough and flexible enough to sort of work over time, then I think it would really set this plan up for success. Looking at the built form, I think it came up a few times, the sort of what looked like thin spaces between the runway and Billy Bishop Way, or Billy Bishop Way and the Green Spine. They sort of look thin, but they're probably not as thin as we think they are. I'm really interested to see what kind of condition and edges are created in those spaces, how they impact the quality of the public realm. Is there going to be a lot of back of house? Is there a lot of loading? And I think that these at some level need to be reviewed at this stage prior to the district planning phase so that we know whether there's enough space or too little space to support that final intended condition for the area. And then regarding governance structures and agreements to support this sort of unique series of open spaces, originally I thought, okay, you should probably look at, there's some decommissioned military bases in the US. I think they've decommissioned like 400 over, since the 80s or something like that. And many have already gone through process or are in process in terms of, working with different developers to create new reuse opportunities. So there might be some interesting examples there. Orange County Great Park in Irvine, California. It's run by a not-for-profit corporation that's governed by city council. Concord reuse project at the Naval Weapons Station. Also in California, that's been going through this process for, the last 15 years with quite a few road bumps, but, they may have explored various governance structures over the years as well. And much, completely to Jim's point, hearing that a lot of the runways pops is concerning. And I would definitely agree that a conservancy or some sort of unique governance structure that's more adept at providing community benefit than the existing POPs model should be pursued. That's it for my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Lots of good comments, most of which I agree with. I'll try to be brief. I wonder about leaving out of this massive planning exercise for a very important part of the future of Toronto, leaving out its historic heart. I understand the technical reasons why this may have happened. I suspect the owners, Canada Land's motivations, but the hangar building is, I think, about to potentially become the largest adaptive reuse project in the history of Canada. Like a 6 or 7 acre building being adapted as a new community hub and educational facility. A major new aerospace campus potentially with a lot of research involving a lot of new buildings. And it's already a great educational hub with Centennial's aerospace campus there. A lot of open space in that zone. So I view that district, which is not described as a district, as the kind of missing district that ought to be there in whatever form. I'm not going to comment on the planning legality and so forth, but its absence from the thinking concerns me. And the absence of integration with the historic heart of Downsview absolutely concerns me. Having said that, I think the larger scaled basic, I would call it infrastructure plan seems quite logical. The 2 north-south, the 2 east-west new connecting streets are critical and essential, as many other people have already described. And at a very high level, those moves ought to help to reintegrate this huge space back into the community at large. However, I do have some specific comments about what I would call the larger organizational structure of the plan. The first is about the east-west connections as they hit the rail corridor. In both cases, the north connection and the south connection, I am concerned. I did not see evidence of investigation that would show me that the grading requirements to allow those east-west connections to go under the rail corridor and how those kind of feather out and then result in development areas or open park space. In the southern one, there's open park space on one side of it, but not the other. Well, how does that work in terms of the grading and land use? In the north one, it's not clear at all how it's going to work. And in terms of, and so while I think those are good locations, I'm not challenging those. I am not confident about the land use and the nature of land use attributed to the zones around those east-west connections because of the grading implications. And it's not clear to me that, at least I haven't seen sufficient evidence of how that's going to work. So I think more attention needs to be paid to that, those east-west connections and how they cross the rail connection. The second thing that I think is significantly missing from the overall armature, the transportation armature, if you will, the street and block network, is the north-south connectivity along the rail corridor. I think that's a major deficiency in the plan. There's a 30-meter setback required, as we all know, from rail corridors to any form of development. At the moment, Centennial students that come by transit and try to get to school have to subject themselves to a really, really awful walk from the subway station down to the school. And that should be an early objective. I appreciate this isn't about implementation, but my point is that I think there's a major opportunity of pedestrian bike connection along the rail corridor that does not seem to be addressed in the plan and ought to be. Street D's intersection with Shepherd, I'm dubious about, and I'm dubious about why it needs to get all the way to Shepherd. There's a substantial drop in Shepherd as it moves from east to west, and when it hits Street D. Has that drop in grade been closely examined? Is that real? Do we really need another intersection on Shepherd that close to the one just to the east, which is the primary entry to Downsview at the moment? So that part of it I'm skeptical about and wasn't clearly described to me in a way that made sense. The other armature element that I think is missing is the complementary element, if you will, of north-south connectivity for pedestrians on the west side of the railway to complement the runway on the east side of the rail corridor. You can imagine this whole new community. I really love the idea of organizing the new community around the old runway, and that old runway become a primary north-south connection route, and ultimately to the subway. On the west, if you arrive at Downsview now, the big park that Jim Melvin had something to do with a long time ago is in the southwest quadrant of Downsview. A lot of people arrive by subway, they get to the Downsview station, and now they have to go through what at the moment is not a very pleasant walk from the Downsview subway station to the park. But in the future, in the, I think it's the Downsview West District as it's described, what I see lacking there in that Downsview West District is a kind of green pedestrian connection that provides the clarity of the need for a very strong pedestrian connection from the subway to Downsview Park. And I would simply observe that the geometry of the railway and the geometry of Shepherd here provides an opportunity for a green space that can connect from the subway station down to the park and can open in its dimension as it moves south. And I would strongly recommend that be considered. And I think my final observation would be about school sites and the scale of the place. In my previous experience in dealing with large district plans, schools can be very tricky. School boards can be very fussy. And they can have a huge impact on the future planning. If the school boards are not engaged, if they're not involved, if they're not part of the mix, it can lead to a lot of difficulty down the road. So some questions. All right, will schools be integrated into buildings? Or will school boards be insisting that they be independent building be independent buildings with large amounts of additional green space, additional to the green space that's already identified. That's a tricky topic. And I would just encourage the group to engage in that topic sooner rather than later. I appreciate it's a high level. I'm not trying to define the schools precisely, but I think schools play such an important role in the future of our communities. How do we integrate, something like a dozen schools into this place over time? What are some of the principles that ought to guide that integration? I would suggest more thinking on that topic, but encouraging work, very important work. Thank you all involved. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody, for your comments, and thank you to the city for bringing this important and hugely significant project. It's difficult on so many levels to conceptualize what it will, what the right answer is at this stage, and how it will transform over the first 15 years, next 15 years, whatever time frame you want to choose. But I think that the 5 points that seem to have risen to the top here are the following. In looking for a heart or a core of the area, we landed on the question of what is the vision? There's an overwhelming need to make a consolidated, layered design and plan that anticipates as best as possible and coordinates a bold vision, one that addresses the complexity and details of this significant development. This has to include the heritage resources that exist in the area already. Within that point, a note to think of and study the green spine as a defining and central, along with the heritage resources, as a defining and central feature of the greater area, and consider it holistically. A green infrastructure that expands its influence throughout the area beyond just the spine. Point number 2, embrace and mandate the goal of climate resilience. Understanding that there are complexities around that, but that we have a duty to create climate resilience wherever we go now, and whatever we plan. And the policies and thinking right now at the moment do not yet require or mandate meeting the overarching goal of sustainability and climate resilience. We have to think 30 years into the future. So some examples of things that seem that shouldn't really be options, but that should be something that are baked into the planning: district energy, green infrastructure, more forestation, the Downsview forest, I think, as Jim called it. A suggestion within that to really, as part of that goal of climate resilience, to use the parks and the green spaces as a stronger infrastructural piece that helps define the area and the hearts of the different areas within the development or within the area. 3, a need to review or reconsider the phasing plan with the goal of providing equitable and timely access to major parks and other community amenities, including transit, road infrastructure, and green infrastructure. So that even those first folks who are there and living and working there are able to access those pieces of the plan that might not necessarily have been thinking, that wouldn't have been developed with the get-go, that were going to be developed more piecemeal. The idea that these should be all developed earlier rather than later. 4, the work so far is addressing the right elements, but the panel notes the particular characteristic nature of the area that is long with a lack of density or density depth across its width. There's a need to study this particularity and apply lessons learned from other areas that are similar to this. Consider how to develop strong self-sufficiency of the various zones and districts, but while simultaneously thinking about how to encourage connectivity across them as well as north-south through the area, creating that connectivity, particularly along the railroad. Number 5, core employment lands. Does there need to be a hard line between them and mixed-use areas? Panel suggested really thinking hard about blurring that line, sprinkling those two areas into each other. Those were the 5 major points that arose through the conversation. On this item, there is no vote because, again, it is a study and not a proposal. So with this, with these concluding remarks, this is the end of the review of item number 2 and the end of our session today. We thank everybody very much for coming today, for your comments and for your hard work. We look forward to seeing developments in both these projects down the road. Our next session is July 13th. Wishing you on behalf of the panel, everybody and the chairs in the city, a good summer until we see you next. Thank you.
Thank you. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair.